Welcome back to the John Fredericks Radio Show. This is Mike Rubino guest hosting for John Fredericks. We have Dan Hoffman coming up in just 1 minute. He is a former CIA station chief and a Fox News contributor. I know he did quite a lot of hits yesterday. Dan, I want to welcome you to the show. It is always my favorite part of hosting this radio show is getting to talk to you and hopscotching around the globe talking about everything going on.
Hey, thanks a lot. It's always a pleasure to join you on the program.
Well, thank you so much. So the way that I've been looking at this is 2020 has been a very interesting year for the country and the world, obviously. But people have become so, I think, self-absorbed, right? They pay attention to, canceling Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben's rice, that they kind of forget that there's a great big wide world out there. And there are geopolitical threats to the United States. There are interesting events going on in the world that do affect us. And the first thing I want to talk about is kind of a subset of China policy, and that's what has happened in Hong Kong as the new security law was passed. So, if you can first, would you mind just walking our listeners through exactly the history there between China and Hong Kong, and when China promised to leave Hong Kong alone as far as their policies, and then what this new law does?
Yeah, that's a big deal. It was in 1997 on this day that the United Kingdom turned Hong Kong back over to China, and the idea was that there would be one country and two systems, and recognizing that Hong Kong practiced a degree of autonomy, both commercially and politically, with a commitment to human rights and democratic representation that didn't exist in China in 1997, certainly doesn't exist today. That era is over with this new security law, where the Chinese government now is exercising draconian control over freedom of speech, freedom of assembly in Hong Kong, and that will have an impact on Hong Kong's economy. It will have an impact on the world economy as well. It's something that the United States will have to grapple with going forward.
Well, it's kind of terrifying. In Hong Kong, the museum that commemorates the 1989 Tiananmen Square event is rushing to digitize its archives because it's afraid that the artifacts themselves could be seized. So you have what Americans take for granted, right? Your booksellers, your professors, they're all terrified about this new law. And I don't think that it's just happenstance that the day that is usually observed as a huge pro-democracy day, that this law has come down, because China, with the current, long history of protests that they've had in the last couple months, obviously they're sick and tired of this. Now, how exactly did this security law come to be? I know it's less than a day old, but how did this come to be?
Yeah, China had tried to implement a similar law in 2003, and the protest movement in Hong Kong prevented it. And then a year ago, they tried once again, and again there were massive protests, but China has stuck with it. The coronavirus, I think, impeded some of the protests, limited the protests. But at the end of the day, China was able to push this through and show that really there isn't any country in the world, unfortunately, even the United States, that has the leverage required to prevent China from doing this. Already China has begun arresting the police in Hong Kong, doing the bidding of Xi Jinping, have already begun arresting Hong Kongers for just simply assembling. And they're using water cannons to disperse demonstrators, and it's a terribly tragic situation, for sure.
Now, what do you make of the effects that this has on the United States? Hong Kong being a just economic powerhouse, and a place in China that we kind of had a foothold and had an ability to work. What do you think that the ramifications will be? One, for the Trump administration, policy-wise going forward, but then two, any economic ramifications that you can think of?
So I think there's two. First of all, when you look at Hong Kong and the people there are not allowed to fly their banners, chant slogans, and exercise freedom of speech. if they do, they're violating this new security law. So those are massive human rights violations, and our country has always been, a city on a hill and an inspiration to democracy activists worldwide. And so it's important for us to support the people of Hong Kong to find some way to do that. Now, certainly one way to do it is to sanction Chinese officials who are responsible for these human rights violations. That's certainly something that we'll see. I think that the question going forward for us, the second part of this economically, is the extent to which we lose trust in conducting business in Hong Kong as a result of these human rights violations, and whether the financial hub that Hong Kong has been ceases to exist and moves elsewhere as a result.
Well, Hong Kong has always been a haven for, dissidents of China. They've always been able to flee to Hong Kong. And because of that autonomy that Hong Kong was promised when they returned to Chinese control, it's very sad to see that autonomy has, within 23 years, been completely eradicated. Now,
It is. I think it just shows that democracy is an existential threat for Xi Jinping. He's willing to accept the fact that the United States will withdraw our preferential trade treatment for Hong Kong because he wants to squelch any hope whatsoever of the Hong Kongers for democratic representation, and that's very telling, certainly.
well, one more topic on China, specifically this security law, is Taiwan. So, the other right across this across that strait from China is Taiwan, a huge U.S. ally that we have to tiptoe around because of the one China policy. What do you make of Taiwan in this new Hong Kong security law? How worried are they? How worried should we be that Taiwan is worried?
I mean, I think so. First of all, Xi Jinping, who's really mounted an extraordinarily aggressive foreign policy since taking power in 2012. I mean, he's made it clear that for Taiwan, unification is going to happen. It's a historical inevitability. And he's trying to, entice Taiwan with some economic incentives, but he's also been very blunt about warning that their independence isn't going to last. And so, Taiwan is under siege. China prevents them from joining international organizations. China has used even the COVID-19 pandemic to coerce nations to take anti-Taiwan policies.
Mm-hmm.
So make no mistake, it's time for us, to double down on our support to Taiwan. And by under siege, I mean in every way. Economically, China violates Taiwan's territorial integrity, their airspace, on a regular basis. China has been concerned that Taiwan was providing shelter to Hong Kong political activists. I'm sure that will continue to carry on. And, it's time, I think, again, for us to think about, what we can do to shore up our relationship. We do provide Taiwan with, lots of diplomatic support, and we sell them arms. But there's probably more now that we can do, given the threat from China, which is only growing.
Well, before we get to Russia, one last Chinese topic I want to cover is the skirmishes between China and India. So, if you can just briefly explain to our listeners exactly what's going on there and why it is a mildly interesting topic that two of the world superpowers are skirmishing.
I mean, they are, and there have been some soldiers killed in action on disputed territory and in the border there between China and India. It is, it's certainly the chance of a major war between those two countries is extremely remote. But make no mistake that they are very much at odds with one another. And of course, China's ally in that region is Pakistan, which is India's enemy.
Right.
And there have been many clashes as well between Pakistan and India, and it's never a good thing to see, nuclear-armed powers, in kinetic attacks against one another, killing each other's soldiers, and unable to solve basic border disputes diplomatically.
This is Mike Rubino, guest hosting the John Fredericks Radio Show. Hopefully I'm doing a good job standing in for the commander of common sense. We have Dan Hoffman with us, Fox News contributor, former CIA station chief. Dan, where can people follow you on Twitter?
In D.C.
Okay, so that's Daniel Hoffman, DC.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, Dan, we have about 7 minutes left. What is going on with this Russian bounty story? It's I'm so tuned out at this point to just all the nonsense being spewed by the media. Um, Walk us through it. I know you did some hits on Fox News yesterday about it. What's going on?
Well, what's going on is that if, according to what we've learned from press coverage and a little bit from our elected officials who have been briefed, um, the U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan interrogated captured Taliban militants who reportedly told their interrogators about a Russian bounty program where the Russians would pay the Taliban money to kill U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan. Now, for the listeners, it's important to understand that these are captured Taliban militants. They're not source penetrations. In other words, when I was serving overseas multiple years in overseas war zones in South Asia and the Middle East, we ran penetrations. We had sources inside Al-Qaeda and inside the Taliban who would tell us protected secret information, and we had a reporting record on them. We knew whether what they had said was over time considered to be true or not true, and we had some level of control over them. In this case, these are guys who were recently captured.
Mm-hmm.
People, they were militants whom we had probably just seen for the very first time, who probably had an interest in influencing as well as informing. Now, I'm not saying that what they were telling us wasn't true. It just means that we need to test the veracity of that reporting by really doing what's all source collection from other elements in our intelligence community, with our coalition partners. And the other piece of this that's important to emphasize, too, especially since 9/11, the threshold on sharing threat information is very, very low. So this information would have been shared immediately with all of our troops in harm's way in Afghanistan. We would have shared it with obviously our coalition partners. The British have over 1,000 troops, so does Germany. Italy has almost 1,000. And we would have sent out requirements to our intelligence collectors to see if they could collect more information on this allegation. Now, I served in Russia many years, and I can tell you that, Russia reality always exceeded my capability of imagination. So, is this possible? Sure. The Russians have been providing material support and small arms to the Taliban for years. They've hosted peace negotiations, and they want influence. But at the same time, I wonder, look, if you give the Taliban a sniper rifle, how much more do you have to do? You assume they're going to target us with that rifle.
Right.
Why would you need a bounty program that is risk of being discovered, except for Vladimir Putin's own interest of targeting us and doing it in a pretty nefarious and rather open way. So, there's more work to be done. The last thing I'll say is that the leaks have made it harder when information like this leaks out. It just makes us harder to go back to that intelligence stream and collect intelligence. It's harder for our sources now to ask questions about something that is right there for everyone to see, highlighted in the public square.
Well, I'm looking at an article it's actually September 2010. It's from NBC News, and it says, report, Iran pays $1,000 for each U.S. soldier killed by the Taliban. So my final question to you on this topic is the bounty thing completely out of the norm? Because it happened under President Obama.
Yeah, I don't know if that was also if that were true or not true. The Iranians did provide, again, a lot of material support to the Taliban, including explosively formed projectiles that they've used to target us in Iraq and as well as in Afghanistan. I don't know if that's true or not true. On this one, again, I think it's out there. Our public knows about it, and imagine all our family members and friends. I've got friends who are serving in Afghanistan right now. I'd kind of like to know if Russia's doing this, and what are we going to do about it?
Right.
And I think your average citizen is going to demand that. And frankly, that's where now it's over to the president and his team to wrap their arms around this issue and manage it. And that's not maybe the way they would have liked, because it's out public and in a way that they didn't control, but it's out there. And that's what happens in Washington, D.C. Most everything gets it becomes fodder for the partisan meat grinder, and that's unfortunately where we're at right now.
It is. Now we have 3 minutes left, Dan. I want to touch on two things. One, I believe Vladimir Putin is hours away from seizing power until, is it 2036?
Yeah, he'll be 83 or 84 years old at that time.
What's the likelihood that Vladimir Putin becomes president for essentially life? 80%,
Oh,
90%, 100%?
that's going to happen. He's winning that vote. He's doing this. He planned on this referendum back in April because he wants some public cover for what he's doing, which is really just usurping the powers of the state. And so, no, there's no question that's what he'll be doing. And he'll have that option of staying on now and serving as many terms as he wishes as president, and whoever follows him can do that as well. This is not just about him, but about his own succession planning.
It's a real pity. I mean, Russia has this long history of this occurring, and it saddens me. But last topic on Russia, before we have to go out, is Putin has been urging Turkey and Iran to help promote a peaceful dialogue in Syria. And obviously, Turkey's made an incursion into Iraq. So, if you can, at a very high level, 90 seconds, what's going on in the Middle East? What's Russia's role, and what is Turkey up to?
Well, Syria is really a battleground, obviously, that there's been a civil war going on there for almost a decade, but it's also a backdrop for great power competition. And Russia, Iran, and Turkey are all long-term strategic competitors, particularly in that region. And so, yes, there'll be discussions about peace deals and things like that, but that's not going to happen. None of those countries is capable of delivering peace. They are not considered to be honest brokers. They have their own interests, and they're at odds with one another.
Well, that makes a ton of sense.
I'm sorry for the
No.
Not so optimistic view there. Syria is a petri dish, growing terrorist threats to that region and beyond. Unfortunately, I don't see those countries doing anything at all to bring any solution there, which is why I've always felt like we need to have some small number of counterterrorism forces there so that we can take care of preempting the threats to our own homeland before they're visited on our shores. And I'm not talking about democracy building or anything like that, but we just need to be out there to keep our own people safe.
Well, I always trust your judgment. You've had a long, storied career. Make sure that you follow Dan on Twitter at Daniel Hoffman DC. And Dan, can they see you on Fox News today?
I should be on Fox News today on Bill Hemmer in the 3 o'clock hour. Bill Hemmer reports, and we'll be talking, I think, some more about the Taliban Russia bounty story.
Well, make sure you follow him on Twitter, watch him on Bill Hemmer. Dan, thank you so much for joining me this morning. We have Laura Trump coming up.
Always a pleasure. Take care.